when I first moved to Philadelphia, only about 6 years ago, but I was working in the nonprofit world and working really closely at a drop-in center with people who were living outside. And so learning about their strategies, their ways of navigating in the world and claiming ownership in a more intimate way than most people do of public space. It felt like a really important thing to lift up for everyone to like be aware of, like, oh, you think you're walking through a park, you're actually walking through somebody's living room. And the ways that people who rely on the land in a more intimate way and space in a more intimate way uh, navigate the space, what kinds of plants are useful to them, how the how the ways that the greenery shifts over the seasons prevents or creates different kinds of protections for them or risks for them over the course of the seasonal shifts and changes in this temporal environment that we live in. So things like that I found were sort of what I imagined I would be writing a piece about. And they do, come into this piece through a couple different characters and their narratives, this sense of a primer for living outside. And one of the things that has struck me as I've gone back even more recently, like when I started writing this play, there weren't people living in trailers and in RVs in the parking lot where we begin. And now, like, because I imagine because of the economic situation and the more dire situation that we find ourselves in 2 years later, like that is a reality that we start the trail with. And the presence of people making space for themselves and home for themselves along this trail has always been there. And now it feels even more apparent.
I'm so glad that you talked about the way that this trail has shifted over the 2-year development period, because that was a question I had, is like the animating impulse of this work feels so prescient now. I was wondering if it had always been this kind of who can take up space in public,
Yeah.
who is allowed to, and what kinds of systems of support did they build to ensure that they continue to be able to.
Yeah, and I think that comes up with a few different characters, right? So there's a character who makes his home on an abandoned ship, and I'll be able to talk about that more later. But the strategies that he uses, during the Great Depression, when he was making that work for him, versus the strategies that someone who was hoboing around in the around the turn of the century, where for white people who were hobos or super tramps, as W.H. Davies named himself, where the sense of generosity of the general public, particularly outside of cities, but also in cities, like people took care of the vagabonds, the hobos, in a way that feels really foreign today. And that's actually part of why I created that character in the specific way I did. But I feel like we're touching on things that we're going to touch on later. So it's all really connected in ways that feel maybe not self-evident, but to me they are, which is why I wrote it the way I did.
That's what I deeply enjoyed, is kind of the way that these layered histories all inform each other, that no character is there to speak about one perspective, that they all kind of represent multiple and the intersections of those. So just to give everyone some background, for each individual circuit trail that is featured as a part of TrailOff, there's also a nonprofit partner. And for this particular trail, the nonprofit partner is the Independence Seaport Museum. I think it's the only museum partner attached. I'm interested to know kind of From you, Eppchez, what was your experience of working with them? How did that help you to inform some of the themes and characters in the work over the course of the development?
Yeah, so my partnership with them, it was very much in the archives. I did, just go into the museum, and while I was partnering with them, I was able to go to the museum for free. So I did check out all the exhibits and stuff and have fun with the various interactive exhibits that they have there. But mostly I was in their library, in their archives, going through tapes. There were a couple different things I was interested in that really piqued my interest there. One was, it's called the Three Sisters shipwrecks, and they're three, well, I think there were originally five, but three big ones, schooners that were sort of docked for repairs and never really got the repairs they needed and fell into disrepair right below the strip mall area where the story begins. And when there's not a lot of vegetation on a clear day, if the tide is low, you can kind of see them. Or if you take a kayak out on the Delaware, you can go around and see the hulls of the ships there beneath the water. And they were actually burned following an incident in which some children were hurt poking around on them. They were burned for public safety, but there were three individuals and a dog living out on them at the time. And so that history of those boats was something that I was looking into. And I was also looking into wobbly history, so labor union history on the waterfront. Dock workers in particular were wobblies, and the nature of that history, Philadelphia as an organizing town, as a labor union town, and the wobblies in particular as a labor organizing group that was interracial, that had Black leaders, and that really believed in the tenets of togetherness. And not that there weren't issues that they had around racism and the like, but it was, especially for the time, a really revolutionary thing for people to be labor organizing across race lines. And one of my characters is inspired by Ben Fletcher, who was a really important organizer in the wobbly cause. And one of the other weird connections is that they had this icon that they would use, the Sabo Tabby, that they would kind of paint on different things, the connection of the Sabo Tabby with sabotage and various tactics that they would use. But that's the icon part of the icon of the story in the app is inspired by that particular image that wobblies would use. And then there are so many cats along the trail too. It was like kind of perfect. But I was actually in the archive at the Seaport Museum able to listen to interviews with a bunch of, they were much older now when they were recorded. I think it was recorded in the 80s, but interviews of people who had been organizing with the Wobblies, with the International Workers of the World. And so much of what I used came from that research as well, or the story that I built. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the piece feels deeply historical, but also deeply fantastical and magical at the same time. Like some of the characters are talking cats, the spirits of the litter from the Walmart nearby. It just really kind of animates these stories in a way that really gives you like a handhold in, and like a fantastical handhold that hopefully piques people to learn more about kind of the deeper histories here.
Yeah, I hope so, because I was really only able to like touch on the history. As far as I'm concerned, like I would like to go a lot deeper with the history, but
Mhm.
yeah.
So we talked a little bit kind of before we invited in the participants here, just about what each of our experiences had been with that environment, like this kind of Delaware River waterfront south area prior to joining on the TrailOff. I'm interested to hear from you, Eppchez, kind of what did you know about that trail before you signed on? Like what experiences had you had with it?
I had mostly been on the Washington Street Pier before, and that is a pier that had a lot of different performance projects, art projects on it, and I'd been involved a little bit with Headlong they did the Quiet Circus
Mhm.
in that area of the trail, and so I had been going out there for these kind of art romps for a while, and it had made me already think of that space as a space where everything feels heightened to that artistic level. That piece involved things like they would put different objects around, and it was kind of like up to the viewer if it was trash or if it was art. And that kind of ambiguity, I think, also really inspired the heightened nature of the everyday things that we might find in the space that I hope kind of, I mean, it goes through the work with a character like Baggins, this collective voice of the consciousness of litter that is always, begging to be picked up and taken to the trash can.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. I had also really spent most of my time in that area on Washington, the Washington Pier, which is interesting to me in kind of its dubious ownership. Like it's definitely, there are development plans to turn it into like another race street pier, but I don't know how they'll ever get in there because we're always having parties and like DJ Yusuke is always there and like Concreta is always there. So it's interesting to think about how that is kind of a contemporary echo of the history that we talk about in the work.
I think that was a big theme that ran through it, is just public and private space. And like when you have private space that everyone uses as if it's part of a public park, when you have a public park space that is actually has all of these restrictions technically on it that make it feel private, but it's still used the way that people need to use it. And when you have people who are there by necessity, I was just really intrigued by
Like the fugitivity of ownership,
mhm.
right? Like
Yeah,
it's
and the
yours as long
futile
as it's collective
exactly
asset.
right. And like, what does it actually mean to own something like land
Mm-hmm.
in such a public place, especially? But generally, what does it even mean to own something like land?
Yeah.
And the kind of it, so I mean, it's something that I've come to feel as like an inherent wrongness to that concept, when we think about how usership and that kind of partnership that people foster,
Mm-hmm.
collaboration with the land, that in my mind creates much more of a true kind of not ownership but
Usage as like
reciprocity. Yeah.
domain, like usage as
Mhm.
indicator of domain. That's interesting.
and and I think, like, I don't know, to me there's something that's like that feels inherently queer about that. I don't know.
Well, we're about to get
I
into
see
that. That's
queerness in
pretty.
everything, but yeah, absolutely.
Well, I definitely agree. Like, not that that's the point of this by any means, but like, I definitely also feel this sense of like, okay, I'm crawling under a fence to get to a pier where there is a secret party. In what ways is this building on histories of queerness, like of ways that people have claimed eminent domain of the space just with usage and with their bodies. And with that, I definitely want to invite Bob into this conversation because I really want to zero in on a little bit of the spirit of cruising and queer history that enters into this work. I'm hoping, just as like an entree in, that we can kind of collaboratively define cruising for our audience today in a way that is focused on the content of what it is and not the character of what it is, because I'm not interested in getting into that. But I want to talk a little bit about what cruising is, like just logistically.
Well, as I was busy listening to everything that I was hearing kind of gay intersections all over the place, LGBT history. Of course, how a place is used, who's using it, changes over history as the identity of the place changes. I like to say that gay people kind of take control of urban environments. In two ways. They go to places no one else wants and they make them their own, or they lose themselves in places that are so crowded they can accommodate all kinds of people. And cruising happens in both instances. By cruising, I like to define cruising as a way of, in a public situation, a semi-private situation, recognizing someone who's like you. And things come into this like gaydar, being able to recognize someone else who is queer. And as such, cruising applies both to men and women. Simply recognizing someone who's like you, being able to talk to them, meet to them, and possibly have sex with them. So all of that comes into cruising. And I love to see how queer people take not only urban, but rural spaces and in a way make those geographic spaces their own. I think life in a big city is all about talking about who's welcome where and what they need to do to make sure that the space that they claimed is truly theirs.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that cruising very much is something that we hold as like a thing inside of queer culture. But in reality, I think it's a name that's given to something that happens across all cultures, right? Straight people cruise, like, trust me, like, I know some, and they do. And, like, it's just, it's this thing that I do think it's important that it be held within queer culture because it is differently politicked within queer culture, of course. But at the same time, it does feel like another way in which there's something that queer people do that becomes inherently different because it's queer, not because of the actions and the logistics that make it up. So I don't know, I'm interested in this area, right? This trail over on kind of the south region of the Delaware River waterfront, because this is a big cruising location in history. Can you give us a little illumination on that? I know we talked a little bit about Judy Garland Park on the phone.
Oh yeah, but that was on the Schuylkill River. Judy Garland Park was on the Schuylkill at the other end, but both rivers. I mean, the history of the riverbanks are the lifeblood of the city in the 18th century, all the way through the 19th century. And we tended to move away from the river. The Delaware River was still busy in the early 20th century. There was a spur of the Frankford line that went all the way down to South Street on the Delaware because there were ferries and ship lines going across to Jersey and going up and down the Delaware. And as those died off, we tended to turn our backs on the riverfront. We've been working to reconnect with it, like in the last 20, 25, 30 years, mostly unsuccessfully, I have to say. But yeah, we're certainly making a good stab at it. And I think areas like shorelines, rivers, are places that once the city abandons them, mainstream, they become places available to queer people. Eppchez, you were talking about hobos. I've done a lot of research into people arrested in city for dressing in non-gender conforming ways. And oddly enough, in some cities, it was illegal to dress non-gender appropriate clothing. That was never true in Philadelphia. They always found reasons to arrest people. for lewd behavior, and they would trump up charges. But when I read about hobos traveling through the city, there are two ways that happens. It's gender identified men dressed as women, and women, many of whom are lesbians, dressed as men. And they're often picked up in train yards, railroad yards, and along the river where they would have entered the city. What I found really amusing is when they question people about why they're dressed not gender appropriately, the men say, I need to dress as a woman because I couldn't get a job as a man. And the women who are dressed in traditionally male clothing say, I could only get a job because I needed to dress as a man to do that. So they're both giving the same excuse, and obviously there's a lot more going on there, a lot more going on. It wasn't the time or place to say, this is how I'm comfortable dressing.
Mm-hmm.
So Bob, I just want to highlight the work that you do here in Philadelphia. I think it's really, really stunning and important. There's something really important about not just telling people queer history, but showing it to them in physical space. Can you talk a little bit about what you see your role is as a steward of kind of Philadelphia's queer history, especially as it relates to tours?
Yeah, I love to look at history as kind of anchored in geographic spaces, because the spaces are always there. They don't disappear, they change. Their physical appearance change, but the space is over. When you're standing in a place talking about what happened there, it makes a much more visceral effect on people. They can relate to a lot more when they're standing there. So I give walking tours of the Philadelphia neighborhood, and of course give tours all around the city. But I feel like my job is to make LGBTQ history a part of history, period. And we're getting better at that. We're getting better at not just, I can say this as an old white man, not just telling the stories of old white men. We're getting a lot better with that. By the way, we're starting to evaluate the kind of people we raise monuments to, for instance, which is happening a lot now. Whose story gets told, whose story doesn't get told. I think that tells a lot about us as a culture, the people we tend to honor and the stories we tell. So I'm so glad that's starting to be addressed. We're starting to question that now, which is wonderful. And I do a Philadelphia LGBT mapping project where I've mapped over about 1,200 sites now that have some kind of LGBT association.
I just think that's so stunning. It's Philadelphia prides itself as a city that holds its history very, very dear to itself, but whose history is that and from what perspective is kind of an ongoing conversation. So to really, I think what I deeply enjoyed about this work of Eppchez's and the work of Bob and how these things are intersecting together is what Eppchez is doing is showing us how exciting and vibrant and interesting this history is, right? And in getting us in there, and in the hopes that many, many more people will be tempted to learn more about their history and where they are here in Philadelphia. And cruising is a part of that history, and I don't see any reason not to include it in what we're all talking about. You know, I guess I am kind of responding to a straw man argument of like, well, why is it important to talk about these moments in queer history instead of other moments, you know, I've spent some time in the John J. Wilcox archives, and one of my favorite things that exists there is a big poster for the Blue Ball. And I don't remember which year it is, but Grace Jones is the performer, and it's literally where the Dave & Buster's is now on Columbus Boulevard. And it's just this stunning artifact that like your city is so much more interesting and more vibrant than you could ever understand. Like this party with Grace Jones was like where people now like eat cheeseburgers and like bowl. Like it's just shocking. And it's important to make that known to people, I think, because I don't always feel welcome in every space as a queer person, right? And to know that other people have stepped there, other people that are like you have stepped there into this area that's now what we call the Brover Flow, of the Delaware River waterfront. It's like Morgan's Pier, it's Festival Pier, it's the Dave and Buster's. It's not a place that feels deeply welcoming to queer people, or like we could set foot there now. But the fact is we already have claimed that space. It already is ours, and that's deeply important to me. I don't know if there's a question in there, but I'm happy to hear any of your reflections to that.
I mean, I certainly have a reflection of around that, and around just the work now of seeing the queerness that was there in history when people in the time may have done so much to hide it. And it requires historians to do something that historians are very reticent to do, I think, which is take a little license. See the clues, read them. Even if in that particular case, it might be a red herring, it certainly happened somewhere for someone, and to feel the validity in that too. And I'd like to talk a little more about Davies here, I think,
Yes.
or like my interpretation of Davies.
Well, can we start actually with kind of the initial way that Davies filtered in here and kind of how the autobiography of the Supertramp makes its way into this work? And then I'd love to talk about how Davies enters into the work as a character.
So the autobiography of the Supertramp is one of W.H. Davies' books. He was a very popular poet at the time of his later life, but no one much knows about him now. His poems are kind of, I don't know. they're the kinds of things that maybe like early 20th century school children would have had in their pockets. That kind of poetry, pastoral and rhymey, but they were very popular at the time. And he wrote this autobiography that he's a Welshman who came to the US and lived as a hobo for a long time, and then went back to Wales and London, and had some amount of success there as a poet. And from looking at pictures of photographs of him, from some little details around his life, the fact that he was a hobo and never grew a beard, the fact that he was cremated, these kinds of details that to me show something that he in fact never really talked about. To me, what it says is this is somebody who, I don't know if they were trans, I don't know if they were intersex, but there is something going on here that they didn't need to talk about, but they passed, and that's that, you know? There's a whole sequence in Autobiography of a Supertramp where they detail an incident where on one of the ships that they were working on, that he was working on, there was a sailor who was discovered to be a woman who was kicked off at the next and given over to the authorities at the next port. And the way that he writes about it is not leering. It's not, this is someone who leers about everything. Who is very unkind in many ways in the way that he writes about many people and many things. And what is expressed in the way that he writes about this incident is something that to me reads like "There but for the grace of God go I." All these sorts of clues that we have to read between the lines because no one is saying it directly. So I think to me, there's that. And then in Appear to Me, in my play, I've cast his spirit into the body of one of the feral cats that lives in this very prominent feral cat colony along the Delaware there. Me and my partner always name cats after poets. So it's sort of an inside joke in that way, but it also really resonates because he talks so much in his book about the ways that hobos were treated. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, the generosity with which people were so often met. And it's the kind of generosity that we only treat feral cats with at this moment in time. And so that that concept, like humanity in Philadelphia right now, or in America in generally, we're not treating less fortunate humans in this generous way that we do treat feral cats. And that historically, people who have chosen to or have gone into a hobo line of work, which is definitely how Davies thinks of hoboing as like a profession, and a way to live and live free, free of all of the various tethers of society. But that generosity is afforded to these cats who live in encampments quite like with everything that has been gleaned by them, quite like the hobo encampments that Davies and all of Philadelphia Slim, Australia Red, all of these characters that he spent a lot of time around lived in.
Just deeply interesting. The work that you're talking about doing and looking back to looking with an open mind at any person's history and not expecting or not expecting, sorry, not anticipating or not anticipating queerness there, right? Reading what is there, considering the source, considering your own lived experiences, and jumping from there or into whatever action feels appropriate for you, whether it is just like deeper research or what. There is something cruisy about that. There is something about like trying to meet the eye of this person in history and be like, wait, I saw something, and like,
yeah, absolutely.
where's the next glance at you?
I've never thought of that way, but it absolutely is a kind of like historical cruising act. And it's something that I don't think historians would feel comfortable doing necessarily, or I don't know, maybe Bob can speak to this more, but I think it's still important as someone who works in fiction.
Eppchez, I want to say I'm so pleased to hear that you're using art to explore themes in history that often academic historians get berated for doing. As a historian, especially as an LGBTQ historian, you're always told you're reading too much into this, you can't use this language. I just want to say this, I've been doing this a long time. No historian ever has to prove that any character in history was either straight or binary.
Mm-hmm.
It's a given. It's a given. But the onus is put on us to prove that anyone might be variant. So I applaud you because I think it's absolutely necessary to explore every avenue possible. A great job on that.
Yeah, and I do want to circle back to this idea of a culture of generosity for those people who live outside or experience housing insecurity. That's deeply interesting to me. I'm reminded of a really kind of bad play. It's not bad, it's problematic in a lot of ways, called Blue's Handbook for the Future Homeless. I'm not remembering the period off the top of my head, but you will find it. And it's a play that's performed a lot by young theater students as a way of, it's kind of like edgy Our Town to a certain group of like theater teachers across the United States. Not to be rude, any of those theater teachers who might see this in the future, including my theater teacher who taught this piece. But there's something in it where the goal of the work is to try and prove that there is no firm, impermeable membrane between a person who is experiencing housing insecurity and a person who is not. That at any point, like in working to kind of degrade this American idea of the kind of security of your station. And I wonder if that has something to do with the ways in which people do not see themselves in people experiencing housing insecurity today, is that there is this idea of that will never be me, or this different rendering of what circumstances lead someone to being housing insecure, living outside. Like there's just a real kind of cultural problem. And I am so deeply struck by what you said about what you said, Eppchez, about the feral cat colony. Because even in just sitting there and going through kind of the opening of TrailOff, like the beginning and speaking to the ranger and doing all of those things, I sat there and watched so many people just come drive by that colony, open their door and like just pet a cat. Like I don't see people do that with like any other animal, you know, like any other person, or just finding these ways in which to approach them. And it just does feel really sad now in rendering it that way. It's really deeply helpful. Anywho, sorry, that was me having an epiphany and then rebooting. I do want to talk just really frankly, like knowing that this is an environment right now where everybody needs everything that they need. How can we support your work, Eppchez, as you're moving forward as an artist, and your work, Bob, as you're doing all this deep and important historical and archiving work? Where are the ways that our audience and any audience that watches this from now on, as it's kind of recorded and in our archives, how can they help you in doing either furthering your mission or help you materially as a person that's doing that work?
Bob, do you want to get that first?
All right, get me out of the way first. First of all, you know, I have to give a pitch to the William White Community Center. Support your community center, absolutely. Support your community. Reach out and be an ally to someone you don't identify with personally, which means that cis gay males need to support the trans community. White queer people need to support Black people. And if it's okay, I'm going to put some links in here to some of my, is that all right to put that in chat?
Yes, please. Thank you, Bob. And that reminds me, I have a couple
just to make it easier. There we are. I write way too much. I just write all the time. So there you are. There are projects I'm working on. There's so much going on around the city. And I love to see more and more, within the past 10 years only, mainstream organizations are trying to include queer voices in their interpretations. So I love seeing that. I'll turn it over to you, Eppchez.
Sure. So I think in writing this piece, there's just, you know, so much of what it was waiting for these, I don't know, ghosts, waiting for these footprints to appear to me on the pier. And those apparitions came in the forms that they came. And they came as the people that they came as, and you know, you'll meet them all when you go and listen to the trail. But I felt it was particularly important to include ways to donate to organizations that were supporting Black trans people and also the Nanticoke Lenape, who consulted with me in writing this, and whose voices are represented by some of the people who showed up to be written about in this work. So the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative has been just an outstanding organization in furthering Black and Brown queer people's abilities to get what they deserve. And I included it at the end of the Trail app as a way to support, and that felt crucially important to me with the context of the voices that are part of this piece. And as well as instructions for becoming, I forget exactly what it's called, but Friends of the Lenape. It's like an annual membership that I strongly encourage people to join. So those two organizations. In terms of my own work, right now I've been, and since June, I've been with my housemates and other Germantown residents, organizing the Germantown Mutual Aid Supply Hub. And that has been a way to put into action some of these things. And we've been working, basically running a free grocery store twice a week, but also helping people find more housing security. There have been 2 or 3 folks that we've been able to help get into more stable housing situations in our community up in Germantown, and also helping Black queer people get cars, pay for their car payments and insurance, those kinds of things. It's always like all these little things that fall between the cracks that, you know, providing thinking about the ways in which that kind of generosity has even become difficult to ask for, because it's not part of our ethos or culture anymore. So trying to fight against that with you know, ways of showing up with mutual aid. So the Germantown Supply Hub, you can find us online. We do accept donations, and also just like stuff donations, mostly diapers and wipes, because diapers are really expensive. And you go through them when you have a little one. So that's been part of my work. And then one of the other things that I've been working on that I hope will be available soon, and this you can see on my website. If you're interested in booking me as a performer, I'm very excited to figure out ways of doing performances, social distance performances. I have several different solo shows that I do and would like to be able to do for organizations or anyone who wants to fund a production. I have recently made a filmed version of my solo show, Public Private, that is also a historical documentary inquiry thing between myself, or a clown version of my earnest, fraught self, and 2 historical trans people who I've come across in research. So I have a film version of that was commissioned, that I will be looking for more places that are interested in screening that. So if anyone comes across this and is interested in doing a screening, that could be great too.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited. I think I caught most of those things in the chat, but if I missed anything, please go ahead and drop that in there. I do have your website up further up. So those people that are looking for me to drop that again, scroll up, please. Thank you so much. So I just want to thank you both so much. I do have time for maybe one audience question. If there's a burning question from the audience, we will make it happen. But otherwise, I do think that we took up most of our time chatting here. Yeah, if you do have a big question that you want answered, you can put it in the chat right now. Otherwise, in about 30 seconds, we're going to say thank you so much to our panelists. But first, I do want to remind everybody that TrailOff continues after the Fringe Festival. Go ahead and download the app. It's on the iOS App Store now. And we do have a few more TrailOff talks coming up. If you want more information about those, you can go to FringeArts.com and then just put in the search bar TrailOff Talks, and they will come up. There are 2 more of those coming up on the 3rd and 4th. We're so excited that you've been able to join us for this portion of the 2020 Fringe Festival, and we do invite you, again, to consider supporting Fringe Arts. It's FringeArts.com/support. Get in there, or don't, you know, it's okay. We know that the times are, so whatever you're able to do is what you're able to do, and that's what we've got for you. Eppchez, Bob, this has been so lovely. It's been such a great way to kind of spend my Friday afternoon. I have so many things to Google and so much work to do, but I do want to pass it back to the 2 of you to see if you have any kind of closing remarks before we go ahead and put this one in our archive.
Likewise, just really great to connect with you, Zach, and with you, Bob. Yeah, I think we had a lot to ruminate on. It was fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. It's just real pleasure to meet you. I hope we can talk again sometime. Thanks for having me here today.
And really want to shout out all of the work that Bob does in town. Want to shout out the John J. Wilcox Jr. LGBT archives at the William Way Community Center. There is no way I would have been able to do like several pieces without that resource here in Philadelphia, and it's stunning and it's so important. They also do have days where you can volunteer to come in and help digitize the archive, probably not right now during COVID, but there will be opportunities to continue to support William Way and everything they do. I used to be a library volunteer. It's a very fun thing to do. You get to read a lot of queer romance novels. Okay, everybody. Thank you both so much. I do think we're gonna go ahead and say thank you for joining us for today's TrailOff Talk as a part of the 2020 Fringe Festival. Have a great rest of your day. Go see a show tonight. You've got lots and lots of time. And everybody be safe. Thank you, Philip. Philip Gates says, thanks all, this was fantastic, just to make sure that you both saw that. And I agree.